Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to join in the study of Torah, sharing relationships within Torah. The more that we share Torah, the more that we make the world a healthier and more whole place. And this week we are in Parshat Vaera, which is Exodus chapter 6, beginning with verse 2. I'm very grateful that we have all taken this time to be together and to share wisdom with one another. So I invite us all to go ahead and unmute at this time so that we can join in saying the blessing of having this opportunity of sharing Torah with one another. We say our blessing. Baruch
atah Adonai
Eloheinu
melech haolam asher kiddushani b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah.
Thank you, God, for this opportunity to come together and to share words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. So again, if now you'd all mute yourselves so that we can read through our verses of Torah together. I'll begin by sharing some verses, and then I'll invite others to have the opportunity to read from our Torah portion. And then at the conclusion of that, I'll share a little bit of a focused study with you. And then after that, invite everyone to have an opportunity to share your own insights and thoughts about this week's Torah portion. So we begin chapter 6 of the book of Exodus with verse 2. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yud He Vav He. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites, because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am Adonai. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements, and I will make you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I, Adonai, am your God, who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession, I, Adonai. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. We're now at verse 10. And Jay Al-Hadif, would you like to read some verses there?
Sure. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart from his land. But Moses appealed to Adonai, saying, The Israelites would not listen to me. How should Pharaoh heed me, a man of impeded speech? So Adonai spoke to both Moses and Aaron in regard to the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, instructing them to deliver the Israelites from the land of Egypt.
Thank you very much, Jay. Let me invite Steve. Would you like to begin reading at verse 14?
I'm going to let Martine do the
Very good.
Hebrew
Martine,
names. I would,
14.
but
Thank you. The following are the heads of their respective clans. The sons of Reuben, Israel's firstborn, Enoch and Palu, Hezron and Carmi. Those are the families of Reuben. The sons of Simeon, Yemuel, Yamin, Ohad, Yachin, Zohar, and Saul, the son of a Canaanite woman. Those are the families of Simeon. These are the names of Levi's son by their lineage, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And the span of Levi's life was 137 years. The sons of Gershon, Libni and Shimei by their families. The sons of Kohath, Amram, Yitzhar, Hebron, and Uziel. And the span of Kohath's life was 133 years. The sons of Merari, Mali, and Mushi. These are the families of the Levites by their lineage.
Thank you so much, Martine. Let me invite Dave. Would you like to read beginning at verse 20?
Very well. Amram took to wife his father's sister Jochebed, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, and the span of Amrai's life was 137 years. The sons of Ishar, Korah, Nepheg, and Zikri, the sons of Uziel, Mishael, Elaphan, and Sithri. Aaron took to wife Elisheba, daughter of Aminabab and sister of Nahshon, and she bore him Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithmar. Sons of Korah, Asir, Elkanah, and Abias. Those are the families of the Korahites. And Aaron's son Eleazar took to wife one of Putiel's daughters, and she bore him Phinehas. Those are the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites by their families.
Thank you so much, Dave. Let me ask Richard, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 26?
Thank you. It is the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, "Bring forth the Israelites from the land of Egypt, troop by troop." It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to free the Israelites from the Egyptians. These are the same Moses and Aaron. For when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, and the Lord said to Moses, "I am the Lord. Speak to Pharaoh the king all that I will tell you." Moses appealed to the Lord, saying, "See, I am of impeded speech. How then should Pharaoh heed me?" The Lord replied to Moses, "See, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh, with your brother Aaron as your prophet. You shall repeat all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh to let the Israelites depart from his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not heed you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and deliver my ranks, my people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt with extraordinary chastisements. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from their midst." This Moses and Aaron did, as the Lord commanded them, so they did. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they made their demand on Pharaoh.
Thank you, Richard. Margot, would you like to read
Sure.
beginning at verse 8?
Sure. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh speaks to you and says, 'Produce your marvel,' you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your rod and cast it down before Pharaoh. It shall turn into a serpent.'" So Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh and did just as the Lord had commanded them. Aaron cast down his rod and in the presence of Pharaoh and his courtiers, and it turned into a serpent. Then Pharaoh, for his part, summoned the wise men and his wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians in turn did the same with their spells. Each cast down the rod and they turned into serpents, but Aaron's rod swallowed their rods. Yet Pharaoh's heart stiffened and he did not heed them, as the Lord had said.
Thank you, Margot. Jim, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 14?
And Adonai said to Moses, "Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is coming out to the water, and station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile, taking with you the rod that turned into a snake. And say to him, 'Adonai, the God of Hebrews, sent me to you to say, let my people go, that they may worship me in the wilderness. But you have paid no heed until now. Thus says Adonai, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and will be turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile will die. The Nile will stink so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile.
Thank you, Jim. Let me invite Gary. Would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 19?
Thank you. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your rod and hold out your arm over the waters of Egypt, its rivers, its canals, its ponds, and all its bodies of water, that they may turn to blood. There shall be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and stone. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. He lifted up the rod and struck it on the water in the Nile, in the sight of the Pharaoh and his courtiers. And all the water in the Nile was turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died. The Nile stank so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. But when the Egyptian magicians did the same with their spells, Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them, as the Lord had spoken. Pharaoh turned and went into his palace, paying no regard even to this. And all the Egyptians had to dig round about the Nile for drinking water because they could not drink the water of the Nile.
Thank you, Gary. Let me see. Let me invite Jay Iser. Would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 25?
Yes, verse 25. When 7 days had passed after the Lord struck the Nile, the Lord Adonai said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Adonai, let my people go that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, then I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs, and they shall come up and enter your palace, your bedchamber and your bed, the houses of your courtiers and your people, and your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all your courtiers. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your arm with the rod over the rivers, the canals, the ponds, and bring up the frogs on the land of Egypt. Aaron held out his arm over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same with their spells and brought frogs upon the land of Egypt.
Thank you so much, Jay. We're on now verse 4. Bill, would you like to read a little bit, beginning there?
As soon as I unmute, yes, thank you. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Eternal to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Eternal. And Moses said to Pharaoh, you may have this triumph over me. For what time shall I plead in behalf of you and your courtiers and your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses to remain only in the Nile? For tomorrow, he replied. And Moses said, as you say, that you may know that there is none like the Eternal our God. The frogs shall retreat from you and your courtiers and your people, then shall remain only in the Nile. Then Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moses cried out to the Eternal in the matter of the frogs which had been inflicted upon Pharaoh. And the Eternal did as Moses asked. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they piled up in heaps till the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he became stubborn and would not heed them, as the Eternal had spoken.
Thank you, Bill. And David and Susan, would you like to read beginning at verse 12?
You. Then Adonai said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your rod and strike the dust of the earth, and it shall turn to lice throughout the land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron held out his arm with the rod and struck the dust of the earth, and vermin came upon human and beast. All the dust of the earth turned to lice throughout the land of Egypt. The magician priests did the like with their spells to produce lice, but they could not. The vermin remained upon human and beast, And the magician priest said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he would not heed them, as Adonai had spoken.
And Adonai said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and stand up in front of Pharaoh. Here, he's going out to the water, and you'll say to him, 'Adonai said this, let my people go so that they may serve me. Because if you are not letting my people go, here, I'm causing an insect swarm to be let go on you and on your servants and on your people and on your houses. And the houses of Egypt will be filled with the insect swarm and also the ground that they're on. And I shall distinguish in that day the land of Goshen, on which my people is standing, for no insect swarm will be there, so that you will know that I, Adonai, am within the land, and I'll set a distinction between my people and your people. This sign will be tomorrow."
Why don't you go ahead and read the next verse?
And Adonai did so, and a heavy insect swarm came to Pharaoh's house and his servant's house, and in all the land of Egypt, the land was corrupted because of the insect swarm.
Thank you, David and Susan. And Justin, would you like to read beginning at verse 21?
Thank you, Rabbi. Thereupon Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, and he said, "Go sacrifice to your God in the land." But Moses said, "It is improper to do that, for we will sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to God, our Lord. Will we sacrifice the deity of the Egyptians before their eyes, and they not stone us? Let us go for a 3-day journey in the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, as he will say to us." Pharaoh said, "I will let you go out, and you will sacrifice to the Lord your God in the desert, but do not go far away. Entreat him on my behalf." Moses said, "Behold, I am going away from you, and I will entreat the Lord, and the mixture of noxious creatures will depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. Only let Pharaoh not tease anymore, and by not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." So Moses went away from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. And the Lord did according to Moses' word, and he removed the mixture of noxious creatures from Pharaoh and his servants and from his people. Not one was left. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he did not let the people go.
Thank you, Justin. Mark, would you be interested in reading at the very start of chapter 9?
My privilege to do so. The Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go worship me. For if you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them, then the hand of the Lord will strike your livestock in the fields, the horses, the asses, the camels, the cattle, and the sheep, with a very severe pestilence. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of the Egyptians, so that nothing shall die of all that belongs to the Israelites. The Lord has fixed the time. Tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land." And the Lord did so the next day. All the livestock of the Egyptians died. The livestock of the Israelites, not a beast died. When Pharaoh inquired, he found that not a head of the livestock of Israel had died. Yet Pharaoh remained stubborn, and he would not let the people go.
Thank you, Mark. Let me pick up here at verse 8. Thus Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, "Each of you take handfuls of soot from the kiln, and let Moses throw it toward the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become a fine dust all over the land of Egypt, and cause an inflammation breaking out in boils on man and beast throughout the land of Egypt. So they took some of the kiln and appeared before Pharaoh. Moses threw it toward the sky, and it caused an inflammation breaking out in boils on man and beast. The magicians were unable to confront Moses because of the inflammation, for the inflammation afflicted the magicians as well as all the other Egyptians. But Adonai stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not heed them, just as Adonai had told Moses. Jehoiada, would you like to read beginning at verse 13?
Sure. The Eternal said to Moses, "Early in the morning present yourself to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Eternal, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go to worship me. For this time I will send all my plagues upon your person and your courtiers and your people, in order that you may know that there is none like me in all the world. I could have stretched forth my hand and stricken you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been effaced from the earth. Nevertheless, I have spared you for this purpose, in order to show you my power, in order that my fame may resound throughout the world. Yet you continue to thwart my people and do not let them go. This time tomorrow I will rain down a heavy hail, such as not been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Therefore, order your livestock and everything you have in the open brought under shelter. Every man, woman, and beast that is found outside, not having been brought indoors, shall perish when the hail comes down upon them. Those among Pharaoh's courtiers who feared Adonai's word brought their slaves and livestock indoors to safety. But those who paid no regard to the word of the Eternal left their slaves and livestock in the open."
Thank you, Jay. Steve, would you like to read now, starting at verse 22?
Yes, thank you. Verse 22, right?
Yes.
Okay. The Eternal One said to Moses, "Hold out your arm toward the sky that hail may fall on the land of Egypt, upon human and beast and all the grasses of the field in the land of Egypt." So Moses held out his rod toward the sky, and the Eternal sent thunder and hail, and fire streamed down to the ground, as the Eternal rained down hail upon the land of Egypt. The hail was very heavy, fire flashing in the midst of the hail, such as had not fallen on the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout the land of Egypt, the hail struck down all that were in the open, both human and beast. The hail also struck down the grasses of the field and shattered all the trees of the field. Only in the region of Goshen, where the Israelites were, there was no hail. Thereupon Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron and said to them, "I stand guilty this time. The Eternal is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Plead with the Eternal that there may be an end of God's thunder and of hail. I will let you go, and you need stay no longer." Moses said to him, "As I go out of the city, I shall spread out my hands to the Eternal. The thunder will cease, and the hail will fall no more, so that you may know that the earth is the Eternal's. But I know that you and your courtiers do not yet fear the Eternal God." Now the flax and barley were ruined, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud. But the wheat and the emmer were not hurt, for they ripened late. Leaving Pharaoh, Moses went outside the city and spread out his hands to the Eternal. The thunder and the hail ceased, and no rain came pouring down upon the earth. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he became stubborn and reverted to his guilty ways, as did his courtiers. So Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Eternal had foretold through Moses.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's our entire portion for the week. Yashikos, everyone. So what I'd like to do is everyone could just mute at your end just for a few moments. I'd like to share a little bit of a focus study, and then we'll open it up for everyone to have an opportunity to share their own thoughts and questions and comments about this week's Torah portion. And I'd like to begin by taking a look at the graphic that I shared with you on this week's Torah study sheet. It is a work of art by an artist named Michael Haftika. He is a contemporary Jewish artist. He works primarily in what we would call the aesthetic of expressionism. And he lives, I believe, in this country now. He lived in Israel for a while. He actually lived on a kibbutz during the Yom Kippur War. And while he has quite a wide range of themes and topics in his artwork, he has focused quite a bit on art that's inspired for him by the Zohar, the great book of Jewish mysticism. And this particular piece is called Zohar, Book of Concealment. Now, the Book of Concealment is a particular section within the Zohar. It actually comes right after the Zohar's treatment of Parshat Vaera, which we're going to be reading in just a few weeks' time. So let me share with you what Michael Haftika, his commentary, the text that he actually attaches to this work, Zohar, Book of Concealment, is a quote from the Zohar, the Book of Concealment. So let me share with you this bit of Zohar that Michael Haftika attaches to his work here. The Book of Concealment, a book balanced on scales. For until there was balance, they did not gaze face to face. Until the head of desire of all desires arranged and bestowed garments of glory. This balance hangs in a place that is not. Weighed upon it were those who did not exist. The balance stands on its own, ungrasped and unseen. Upon it rose and upon it rise those who were not, and who were, and who will be. When we look at this graphic, before we get to the text itself from the Zohar, we look at this graphic, and it is a figure, a rather perhaps emaciated figure, a figure standing in what? Shock, awe, wonderment, before a blank canvas, before a blank page. And why is it blank? Is it blank because nothing's there, or because everything is there? So the Book of Concealment, as it opens up in this text from the Zohar, is dealing with the notion of creation. And as we've discussed previously, the Bereshit, the opening up of Torah, which is about to tell us how everything came into existence. As we've studied it previously, we've acknowledged how opaque that text is, how incomprehensible the text seems to be. And indeed, the Hebrew grammar itself is confusing and ambiguous. So this is a way of beginning to instruct us, if you will, that it's impossible for human beings to fully grasp the origins of everything. The origins of everything, in fact, is concealed from us. At the same time, as we were studying Bereshit, we were kind of provoked by the very structure of that opening sentence, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. We were provoked by that into trying to understand what exactly was it saying. And the Zohar at some point will even go so far as to make a radical statement that God in that opening sentence is not actually the subject of the verb to create, but is the object of the verb to create. That something that seems to be outside the text itself created God, among other things, in the beginning of creation. So as we begin to study this opening sentence, indeed the very opening word, we find ourselves, in a sense, lured into trying to extract meaning from the text rather than merely passively reading a story. We become actively engaged in the creation of meaning. And I think what's happening there is Torah, from the very first word, is kind of seducing us into not merely being passive recipients of some information, but in becoming co-creators of the meaning of the text. And that is one of the foundational lessons, indeed, of the Jewish way, of the way of Torah, which is that we're not merely passive recipients of creation, we are co-creators with the eternal. It's a very profound bit of empowerment that this text and this tradition gives to us. Just a little bit more about the text itself that we just read, where you see the second sentence, for until there was balance, they did not gaze face to face. The reference there of gazing face to face is to the cherubim. You'll see that we, as we begin to discuss in a few weeks' time, the construction of the Mishkan, one of the great pieces that's constructed are these two cherubim, these strange beings who are placed on the lid of the ark. And they are engaged, these cherubim, in this rather extraordinary dynamic tension. It's a physical as well as a spiritual and psychological tension. They are, the text tells us, simultaneously looking downward, which is where the law is inside the ark. So they're looking downward and simultaneously they're looking at one another. So this exercise that they are engaged in, where on the one hand, they're looking at something objective, something outside of themselves, some kind of external objective standard. That's what they're looking at. But simultaneously, they are somehow looking at one another. They are engaged in some kind of subjective, intimate relationship. And so what Kabbalah does with all of this through the Zohar and other Kabbalistic literature is this notion that this is how God comes into the world. God says, that's where I will meet with you, in between the cherubim, in between these characters that are on the one hand looking down at something that's outside of themselves, something that's objective, while simultaneously these beings are looking deeply into one another's eyes, engaged in this intimate, personal, subjective relationship. And Kabbalah will say, this is the notion of this tension between, let's describe it as justice on the one hand and compassion on the other. Kabbalah sometimes will genderize this and talk about, this is about the relationship between male and female energies. So what the Zohar seems to be telling us here is, in order for God to come into the world, there needs to be this ongoing dynamic relationship between, let's call it, justice and mercy, between male and female. And so in this sense, what this body of wisdom is teaching us is, in contrast with some other philosophical orientations, and in particular, Judaism will point towards the Greek tradition, which wants to have things be either this or that. This is the tradition that is rejecting the either or and saying both and. This is the beginning of the multivocal approach of Torah. So this is part of what is happening here in this text from the Zohar. And so what we're seeing in this opening bit is, this is not just a story that we're reading. It's also one that we are writing, because these energies that are being described here by the Zohar are energies that are within us as well as outside of us. So let's look at what's happening within this week's Torah portion. Previously, last week, when we were discussing last week's Torah portion, we observed the absence of names in the opening chapters of the book of Exodus, even though paradoxically it's called the book of names. And yet the names of the main characters are all absent. And I think it was primarily in relationship to a point. I believe it was that Jay made about how what the Zohar looks at in the book of Exodus, this time in Egypt, it describes it as this is the exile of speech. So now we could begin to associate the absence of names with the absence of speech itself. And so within that particular framework, what we have here at the beginning of this story, this time in Egypt, there is this terrible crisis that's going on. And it seems to be a crisis where existence itself seems to be hanging in a balance. And what seems to be threatening existence is this absence of speech. And when we're talking about speech, we're not just talking about the vocalization of words. We're talking about the capacity to communicate and also simultaneously the capacity to absorb communication. And that, the Zohar says, is in distress. And that distress is causing the very existence of civilization itself to be fractured and in question. So let's see how that takes place. So number one on the study sheet, we have verses from this week's Torah portion. It says, the children of Israel, lo sham'u, they couldn't hear, they did not hear. And Pharaoh's heart became hardened, lo shema, he couldn't hear. So what's happening in this week's Torah portion is it's describing that this is the disease that's not just something that is being borne by the Egyptians themselves, the enslavers. There is some kind of disease, some kind of epidemic that has infected both ruler and enslaved, both Pharaoh and the Israelites. They both seem to have some incapacity to hear. And that goes along with the lack of names, the lack of articulation, the lack of the ability to give specific reference and to communicate. So here in number 2, we have this theme that's being continued and is now picked up by our main character in the story, Moses, where Moses says, even the Israelites would not listen to me. Lo sham'u Eli, they wouldn't listen to me. So why should Pharaoh? Thus am I of uncircumcised lips. Here, what's fascinating, I think, is that Moses is saying there's some relationship between, there's a relationship between speaking and hearing. Because they couldn't hear me, I could not speak. Their incapacity to hear incapacitates me from being able to speak. So this is the crisis that this entire civilization is now encountering. And this Moses, our main character, is now mirroring the condition of the entire civilization all around him. And we talked last time that how fascinating it is that our main character, Moses, doesn't even have a name that identifies him as a unique individual. I decided, reading this week's Torah portion and studying it, that perhaps the best way to translate the name Moses is to translate it as the one who is born. So the one who is born is our main character. So we're going to see how this notion about the capacity to speak and to hear gets played out a little bit further, and why it's so critical and what it has to do with us. Okay. So number 3 is from the great late 19th century Hasidic rabbi, the Sfat Emet, who says, language was in exile. As long as they refused to receive the word of God, were not prepared to hear it. In the Midrash, we find they did not hear because it was hard for them to separate from idolatry. In order to hear, one must be clear of all obstructions. This is the essence of exile, even now, that one cannot clear oneself of distractions and forget the vanities of the world. So far we've gotten this notion that both the Egyptians and the Israelites are all infected with this incapacity to either speak or to hear. And the Sfat Emet, as a good chassid, what he does with that tradition of commentary is he now directs us to look inside of ourselves, to say, it's not, this is a disease, a pathology that's happening not just to others outside of you, it's a pathology that we each carry within ourselves. Because this is the approach of the Hasidic tradition, which is to explore one's interior life and to begin to reform it as a way to bring God out into the world. So now, with that approach, we're beginning to have a challenge to this, the storyline that perhaps we learn as children in religious school, which is that of the heroic rescue of the Israelites, or alternatively of the punishing hand on Pharaoh. And we're going to see how the Talmud and then the Zohar say it's a lot more complex than that. So if you turn over, if you have the study sheet, number 4 is from the Talmud, from the volume on Shabbat. And it says this, it says, if one comes to defile himself, he has provided an opening. If one comes to purify himself, he is assisted. In those who've studied with me previously know that when we begin to study about the plagues, people often begin to have this critique about the God character who is manipulating Pharaoh. And he says, well, Pharaoh never had a chance because God was going to harden Pharaoh's heart from the very beginning. And what we've observed in the Hebrew is that for the first several plagues, the Hebrew tells us that is Pharaoh who's hardening his own heart. And it's not until about, I think it's the 6th plague, that then the subject of the verb hardening becomes God rather than Pharaoh. And so I think this is what the Talmud is getting at, which is that we all have free will. And to the extent that we wish to live a life of goodness, that's what we're seeking, then the force of the universe will assist us in some kind of way. If, on the other hand, we're seeking to defile ourselves, to destroy ourselves, then the universe will assist us in that regard as well. And here's how the Zohar takes it. On this very Torah portion has this bit of commentary. Through arousal below, there is arousal above. Until there is arousal below, nothing is aroused above to rest upon him. So what the Zohar, through Jewish mysticism, is now telling us is that the mission of the spiritual practitioner is to engage with those divine energies that are within us in order to externalize them, to live in accordance with them, and to manifest them in the way that we live. And that when we do that, we stimulate some kind of divine presence that's out there in the world. I'd like to turn to a more contemporary commentator. It's a French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard, who was born in 1884, died in 1962. And he was quite interested in the role of speech and the role of imagination. So he wrote this: what is the source of our first suffering? It lies in the fact that we hesitated to speak. It was born in the moments when we accumulated silent things within us. The brook will nonetheless teach you to speak, in spite of sorrows and memories. It will teach you euphoria through euphemism, energy through the poem. It will repeat incessantly some beautiful, round word which rolls over rocks. Here Bachelard is saying that we begin to cause damage to ourselves when we refuse to speak. There is something, he says, about the power of speech that is self-actualizing. It's a necessary component of our self-expression and self-actualization of our coming into the world. To the extent that we don't speak when we should be speaking, we continue to destroy ourselves. So here is number 6. It's a bit of fun, bit of midrash that is going to tell us something about that the Israelites had a spiritual practice, if you will, that enabled them to endure the oppression of their time in Egypt and allowed them to begin to emerge from it. They had a practice that was subversive, that maintained hope during their time of oppression. And here's how the midrash runs. Number 6, from our Torah portion, from the Torah. Pharaoh speaking, saying, "Let them labor and let them not pay attention to false words." And it's playing with these words, let them labor, ya'asu, from the word asha, to make or do something, and then says, let them not pay attention, al yishu, from the verb sha'a, to gaze upon false words. And so now the midrash is going to take over. What is this notion of yishu? They had scrolls in their possession with which they would play. Yishta'ashu, from the verb sha'a, to sport in or take delight in, from Shabbat to Shabbat. These declared that God would redeem them. So Pharaoh said to them, "All Yishu, don't let them play." And then we have this notion of playing with Torah comes up in Psalm 119. If your Torah had not been my plaything, I should have perished in my affliction. The Midrash is picking up on this notion of playing with a Torah scroll. Even though the Torah hadn't been written yet, they had some kind of document, some kind of beginning of a scroll that told stories about their ancestors and what had been promised to them and of the journey that their ancestors had been on. And so the Midrash is imagining that on Shabbat, somehow they would play with these scrolls. They would engage in some kind of dreaming, some kind of reverie, some kind of imagination that would allow them to endure the oppression of the moment because they were able to transcend the moment through that bit of playfulness, through that bit of reverie and imagination. Taking that notion of playing with reverie, of being full of imagination and of transcending through playfulness the oppression and the frustration of the moment, we turn to a early mid-20th century English psychoanalyst, W.R. Bion, who wrote in a book, Cogitations, this. The psychotic's incapacity for reverie means that he destroys the capacity for thought, which is essential to action in reality and which makes bearable the frustration, an essential concomitant of the interval between the wish and its fulfillment. So the psychotic's attempt to evade frustration ends in producing a personality more than ever subject to frustration. I think beyond here is dealing with a personality type who is so rigid, who is so binary that things can only be this or that when encountering life's necessary frustrations is incapable of rolling with it, like Bachelard's round word rolling over rocks. Is incapable of rolling through it or of flowing through the moment, and becomes only more increasingly frustrated. And I think is perhaps contrasting that with a personality that's more adaptive, who can go with the flow, roll with the moment, who's able to transcend through this playfulness. Remember, the scroll is something that rolls, right? It rolls. So that notion about rolling and being playful helps us get through these moments of great difficulty. I'd like to conclude by turning to George Steiner. George Steiner was a literary critic who was born in 1929 to a Jewish family then living in Paris. They had fled Eastern Europe earlier and sought refuge in Paris. And then they fled Paris in 1940 ahead of the Nazis and came to the United States, which is where really George Steiner grew up. And in much of his work, he's very concerned, George Steiner is, with the moral purpose of language and literature, especially in the face of modern barbarism of Nazism, the Holocaust, and Stalinism. And in this book that we have this quote from, In Bluebeard's Castle, he's in particular dealing with the impact of the Holocaust on the trajectory of Western culture. And he sees a unique role that the Jewish people have played throughout history. He describes it as the Jewish people presenting a summons to perfection, a summons to a perfection which we can never achieve, but the aspiration for which we must never give up. Perhaps that's the bit of the revelry, the rollingness, the pursuit of perfection. Even though we're never able to get there, we constantly are we're constantly seeking it. But here's what he says about speech. He says, we empty of their humanity those to whom we deny speech. Break off speech to others, and the Medusa turns inward. I find here two things that he seems to be talking about. One, when we don't hear other people, when we deny others their opportunity to speak, we're denying them their humanity. And then when we don't engage in speech with others, when we're only in a sense talking to ourselves, he describes it as the Medusa turns inward. If you remember, the Medusa is this character in Greek mythology with snakes coming out of her head, but anyone who looked at the Medusa, they would turn to stone. I find it fascinating to think about that in terms of what's happening perhaps to Pharaoh. Pharaoh has this incapacity to engage truly with others, either to hear what others are saying or to have any desire really to talk with others. And so what happens to Pharaoh is, it says, the Medusa turns inward. Pharaoh's heart turns to stone. So the importance of speech, what we're learning about through this bit of traditional commentary and through this more recent bit of commentary, is how important it is to learn to hear and to learn to speak. To remain silent when it's important to speak leads to our own dissolution, our own inability to mature and evolve. Our incapacity to hear others when it's important to hear others leads to our hardening of our hearts. So here we are at the beginning of this story. The balance hangs in a place that is not. Meaning, the story is ours to write. The Israelites have a story to write. And it requires their speaking, it requires their hearing, and our character who's standing in front of that bit of white canvas in Michael Haftika's painting is there at that moment where everything has already been created, and yet it constantly needs to be recreated. And that takes our initiative. It's not something that we're going to receive. We have to be writers of the next chapter. perhaps even the next verse. And to do so requires the great instrument of speech and of hearing. So with that, I'd love to hear what others have thought about, what comments you have, what insights you have about this week's Torah portion. So Susan, would you like to unmute and share with us?
You're unmuted.
So I've always been intrigued or curious about the statement, "Thus am I of uncircumcised lips." And circumcision is seen as our covenant with God. So I was wondering, perhaps this is Moses saying that he isn't ready. He hasn't made this committed to this covenant with God, which is required in order for the Israelites to hear him, and for them to, and their commitment in order to act.
Yes, I think I agree with that. There's many different ways in which to read it. One is he seems to be kind of deferring this responsibility. He seems to kind of, I'm not fit for this. I'm not ready to do this. I'm not capable of doing this. Give the job to someone else. So there's that aspect to it. And then there's also, in what you've just cited here, this notion that Moses himself is as infected as anyone else is by this disease of the incapacity to speak. And it's not just giving voice to something, it is speaking to speak means to give oneself self-expression, to actualize oneself, to engage in a form of communication, not just vocalization. And so he is as infected as the rest of the whole civilization there is. So, yeah, and Jade, Al-Haddock?
Two things I wanted to share. The first thing was at the beginning of the portion, it talks about how God speaks and says, "I see the Israelites now." And every time we read that, I keep on thinking to myself, where has God been all these years? It's sort of like we teach everyone God is everywhere, God is all-knowing. And just that writing, that line just made me start thinking, where has God been while the Israelites have been in this suffering of slavery? That was the first thing. The second thing was about this idea of speaking and listening. A lot of what I think are problems in the world is, especially right now, and I'm not going to try to make this into a totally political thing. I'll try to be as nonpartisan as possible. Neither side listens to each other very well. And I think that was the thing that we see in the story of Pharaoh and Moses, that that Pharaoh wasn't listening to Moses.
In the section that you quoted at the very beginning of our Torah portion, where it says, "I have now heard," it says, "Shamati," I have heard the moaning of the Israelites. And so there's some notion in which finally the Israelites have uttered something that has now brought God's presence and activated God's presence. So again, there's this notion about, rather than having this notion of this heroic being that's going to come save us, rather the Zohar and Kabbalah and the Hasidic tradition in particular, they all say it's up to us. We are the one who bring God into the world. And so there's this notion here that finally the Israelites begin to say something that draws God into the world, that begins this process. Yes, Anna?
I'm this time reading this portion at the very first, I got a new take on, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. Now, people who have studied with me before in the room will know that I often like to say El Shaddai is one of the names for God. And in Hebrew, the plural of that word, Shaddayim, means breasts.
Means what?
Bosoms, breasts.
Breasts, okay.
So it's very different. El Shaddai may be one mountain, but Shaddayim are two. And is there hidden within here, tucked within this text? Tonight I see that God was like a mother nursing Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I appeared to them as El Shaddai, or shall we say Shaddayim, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Adonai. I established my covenant with them, and now I've heard their moaning, and I remembered the covenant. Now, when you have a little baby, you don't talk with words to the baby, and the baby doesn't, well, you may talk, but you know what's going on. Baby's not talking to you, but you can communicate really clear. You know exactly when your baby needs something, or you can tell, you can reach out to them, they can reach out to you before you have speech. So the earlier Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are at a part of growing with God, and Moses is going to get to a part where he, representing all of us, can walk away a bit and have that relationship. But there is the listening and hearing without speaking.
Very nice. Thank you, Ann. Okay, Gary? Go ahead and unmute, Gary.
Okay, I'd like to pick up where Jay left off and also piggyback on the George Steiner regarding speech. If I may make 2 points, I'll try to make them quickly. Speech right now, one of the gifts I think that Torah does teach us is the gift of freedom of speech. And there is a relatively new phenomenon now that we're losing that freedom. Absolutely. And there are new concepts that they're relatively new. Some believe that some speech is hateful, which it is, and some speech is violent. And there are those who feel that that should not be allowed any longer. And I think when we talk about Jews being the chosen people, I sometimes feel that what that means is we're chosen to bring values and teachings from the Torah that I think are valuable for everybody. You don't have to be Jewish. So I sometimes feel I have an obligation to share those within my sphere of influence. And so I invite you who might believe that to share that with people within your sphere of influence, that we need to make sure that we're allowing everyone to speak. Now, where I'm confident and comfortable doing that, a challenge that I have that Rabbi has tried to help teach me over the years is the listening part. I'm pretty good at talking, and if I'm listening to, like you, teaching, I can listen. But if I'm in a heated argument, I find that I'm trying to develop a retort in my mind, and I know that I'm not hearing what the other person is saying. And I'm hoping that just being conscious of that I can improve, but that's a struggle for me. But I'm a work in progress, so hang in there with me, Rabbi. That's what I'm asking.
We're all a work in progress. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gary. Margot?
I just want to say amen to Jay and the other gentleman. That's what I was going to say. And I think it's very sad today that people are afraid to speak, and others, and therefore their speech is cut off and others cannot hear them. And talk about the Torah portions being applicable today. If this isn't, I don't know what one in the Torah would be more applicable than what we've learned tonight. And I also want to thank the whole group. I was very agitated all day today trying to get the COVID vaccine, and being with all of you tonight. Yeah, perhaps it should have agitated me studying Torah, but it had the opposite effect. It calmed me, and I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Margot. And Dave?
First, Gary was saying sphere of influence several times, and I kept hearing spirit influence. Those within your spirit influence. And that's pretty cool. And second of all, for me, very central to Judaism is and clearly what this teaching is about, is the idea that listening and speaking can create in between, and then speaking and then listening creates in between those two actions, behaviors, a spirit influence that is greater than can be caused by either the speaker or the listener, or the speaker or the listener. And it's a very key point of it is to have your ears open while the other is speaking, as Gary was saying. And I mean, the famous point that I love is that the reason why we follow Hillel most often rather than Shammai is because Hillel not only listened to the other side, he gave the other side his school, gave the people who followed Hillel, gave the other side enormous respect, so much respect that when Hillel's school spoke, they started with saying what the other side says. First of all, to communicate that they heard it. And I also always assume to ensure that the other side can correct them if they were mishearing. And then as long as those things are going on and that both sides are speaking for the sake of heaven, meaning not for their selfish interest, but because they want to improve the world and their community and the relationship they have with the listener, then that's what my daughter teaches, where God, that's where God is. In between these two cherubim and above the law is this place that is invisible, sort of, but that's where God happens. That's where God comes into being. That's where what I called the other day the juice of the universe is focused.
Beautiful. Thank you, David. It's quite beautiful. Thank you. Any other concluding comments before I turn to Bill? Any other? So with that, I know that Bill, you have a musical piece you'd like to close with.
Thank you, Rabbi. This is based on the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and music provides that opportunity to both sing and speak and listen. So here we go.
We are a people in whom the past endures. The present is inconceivable without moments gone by. The Exodus lasted a moment enduring forever. What happened once upon a time happens all the time.
That takes us so beautifully back to our opening, that we're not merely reading a story about events that happened a long time ago, words that were written by someone else. We're also bearing witness to a story that's happening at this very moment inside of ourselves, in the world around us, And we have the capacity to not only read about it, but also to be writers about it. I'm so glad to be sharing this writing project with all of you. God bless you all. Look forward to further studying and further writing with you in the weeks ahead. Thank you all very much.
Amen.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good evening
And
all.
thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was so late.
No.